Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our session. Giving a moment, make sure everyone's here, trickling in. All right, welcome. We are the National Museum of Natural History, and we are here for our session, Unseen Connections, Thinking Routines and Exploding Objects. And before we begin, we're just going to go around and do a round of quick introductions with our titles up on the screen. And I'll first take it to Josh.
Hi, I'm Dr. Joshua Bell. I'm Curator of Globalization at the National Museum of Natural History.
Hi, I'm Colleen Popson. I'm Experience Design Manager in the Office of Education, Outreach, and Visitor Experience at the National Museum of Natural History.
And then I am Nicole Webster. I am the Manager of School and Youth Programs at the National Museum of Natural History. So welcome all. And then if we advance the slides, we have a photo of our museum. I'm not sure how many of you out there have either been to our museum, either in person or virtually. Maybe you've heard of us before. Maybe this is the first time you even knew our museum existed. That is fine. Welcome anyway. So when a lot of people think about the National Museum of Natural History, they think about dinosaurs and they think about the Hope Diamond, but they don't realize what goes on behind the scenes. You might be able to tell, even from this image, we're a big building. We are 2 city blocks. And behind all of those exhibits that everyone knows us for, we have hundreds of scientists, researchers, and also educators working. And we like to bring that out from behind the scenes. So within this, we also have a Department of Education. If you can advance, we can go over just some of our high-level goals that we have at the museum. You can advance to the next slide. So our goals. So at the National Museum of Natural History, we strive to help learners pursue their curiosity about the natural world, feel more connected to the natural world, and expand their science identity. And what that means, we want people to walk away thinking, I can do science. I understand that science is a part of my everyday life and that it's relevant to me, and that I understand that science matters. And if you can go to the next slide. Some of our hallmarks, and we have a diagram over here that you can see one of our iterative processes, is that we have object or collections-based inquiry. So at the museum, we have over 145 million objects. That's million objects. And our scientists and researchers use this to do their work. And then in education, we also use this as teaching tools. And everything we do within the Department of Education is aligned with the science and research that's happening here at the museum. All of our design is human-centered and audience tested. So on the screen, you can see one of our processes, the Q method, making sure that everything we do is best aligned to museum practices, museum science, but is also testing well with our audiences and being effective in our goals and our outcomes and our objectives. We are also strong on multidisciplinary instruction because we believe that there are multiple entry points to science. We want to make sure that there is a pathway for everyone to become immersed in natural history science. And then today, what we're going to be doing is that I'm going to be handing it over to Josh, who is one of our researchers. They're going to tell you a little bit about their background and their work, and then we're going to show you how that integrates into an educational tool that you're going to be able to take back to your classroom and apply with your learners. So take it away, Josh.
Thank you, Nicole. You can advance the slide, please. So as I mentioned, I'm a curator in the anthropology department here at the National Museum of Natural History. Thank you all for joining us today. And my training is a cultural anthropologist. And the way I like to think about anthropology at a natural history museum is that we are the kind of hinge discipline that sits within the museum and kind of really helps to understand how humans both do the science that we do, but also understand the world in all its diversity. And anthropology, as many of you may know, it's a study of what humans do in the present, but also as the past, as well as our biology and our language. As a cultural anthropologist, I'm focused on what people do today and the kind of near past. And my primary interest, perhaps not surprisingly working at a natural history museum, is this intersection between people and objects that they use and their kind of wider environment. And I think a key takeaway point for anyone who's not an anthropologist is I think one of the things that anthropology brings as a discipline to teaching and just thinking about the world is that we kind of work in various ways, as Clifford Geertz puts it, to kind of make the familiar strange and the strange familiar, which as a teaching exercise is really, I think, important. And as a discipline, we're one that can kind of continually ask questions of the world and does so in a critical self manner. So if you know the history of anthropology, we've gone through a lot of changes over the 200+ year history. And we do this through engagement with the communities that we're working with. And so that the term we typically use is participant observation, and we use this with many other methods. And we work everywhere and anywhere humans are. Now, in the slide, I'm just showing you where I kind of began my long-term field work as a cultural anthropologist is in the Prairie Delta of Papua New Guinea, where I've spent time living and working with people at their invitation. Now, for those of you who don't know Papua New Guinea, it's an island north, or half of an island really, north of Australia in the Southwest Pacific. And it is a unique country with over 850 languages spoken by almost 9 million people. It's the most linguistically diverse region of the world. And it is a country that's only slightly larger than California in landmass. And alongside of that, paralleled biological diversity. It is a region that's been a center point of anthropological research for over a century. And that's in part why I went to kind of study, to follow in the footsteps of other anthropologists and kind of understand where the communities I work, how they are using objects to narrate the history, construct their identities, and understand their place in the global economy, and particularly in the wake of resource extraction, logging. So another way of thinking about my work is thinking about trying to make sense of the interconnections and relationships that people, regardless of their locality, make through objects. And this image that's up is an illustration that was actually made as part of an earlier science education project that we did around logging and rainforests and oral histories. So why I bring this up is that it was actually through this immersive learning in Papua New Guinea that I really began to kind of understand and see people making things. And it was in this context that really this routine first emerged. But as I'm going to talk about, it can be applied anywhere. And I've used it in my more recent work, which is in Washington, D.C. So it is cross-cultural. Next slide. So a core question that and you can advance to the question, the question that I like to think about that emerged in my work in the Prairie Delta is this question of where do objects begin and end? And I think about that a lot in terms of my own research, but I also use it to provoke students. And here, and I throw it all at you, looking at what you're looking at right now is an image of feathers and quills from a southern cassowary, which is a large flightless bird that lives in the rainforests of New Guinea, as well as Australia. Now, in some ways, this could be said to be an image that's the end of a cassowary, right? I was on a hunting trip. This cassowary was killed for food, but then it also is a beginning of sorts. And so what you're looking at is a friend of mine collecting the cassowary feathers and quills, which are actually used for headdresses and other objects that Prairie speakers use for traditional adornment. So think about this question really begins us to think about processes of making and a whole sets of things. And what hopefully we will show you is that also gets you to think, unsettle what people think in our cultural context in the US of kind of where objects begin and end, so to speak, as well as the kind of connections, what we like to think about as the unseen connections in all things. Next advancement. So following this question, when I think about this, particularly when thinking about objects, it brings out a range of things, but they can be distilled, these relationships, into 3 sets. One is thinking about materials, one is thinking about makers, and then one thinking about what a fancy anthropological word, ontologies or cosmologies, stories about origins. And so when I run this exercise that we'll get into, I typically have, I think about myself in about the materials and the different aspects of those materials, think about makers, ask questions about who made it, divisions of labor, what are the contexts of making, and then, where are the stories that and people's understandings of the objects. All right, next slide, please. So if Papua New Guinea is a source of kind of inspiration of thinking about these things, I also take inspiration from what you're looking at now, which engineer drawings. So these are exploded diagrams that if you've put together anything such as IKEA furniture, will have seen a version of this. So these are schematics, which are another way of thinking about instructions at one level, but also opening up an object visually to look at the materials and stage of making, or the layers. And kind of what I like about these diagrams is that they kind of make very concrete things that are otherwise hidden. And one way of thinking about this routine is that we're not only doing that with objects, but we're also thinking about the relationships, which generally are not visible at all with these objects. So before I hand it over to Colleen, I've got some other examples of what this routine looks like in terms of the work I've done. And I share it with you to kind of give you a sense of different ways of doing this, because one thing that I would say about the exploding objects is that there's certain core features of thinking, but it can take various forms. So there's no kind of set way of doing this. And really, it's an invitation to explore. Next slide. So in the Prairie Delta, I've worked previously to understand baskets that women make, and I have one actually here called an ake. And these are baskets that women make. They're made out of sago palms, and they use the leaves actually of these baskets. And so on the left, I'm showing you a picture of a sago palm, and then I worked with an illustrator to explode one of these palms and label the local terminology. And we did that as a kind of way of thinking about local terms, thinking about ethnobiology, but also making a different way to visualize this information for the communities, actually. And this was a poster that we made for school groups to kind of help raise awareness about knowledge that is kind of waning and not readily used because of changes in the community about actually making these baskets. Next advancement. And the next one. Part of this, though, what I did was to also then work with the community to document the different ways in which the sago palm is used. So I bring this up to say that this project also involves a chance to hone interview techniques, thinking and interviewing experts, which is worth mentioning. Next slide. So in 2012, I worked with colleagues at George Washington University, specifically Joel Kuipers, and then research assistants Brielle Kobach, Amanda Kimball, and Jacqueline Hazen to study third-party cell phone repair in Washington, D.C. And we did that as part of a larger project on cell phones that's leading up to an exhibit that I will talk about shortly. But here we were interested in how do you document the stages of cell phone repair. And so what we did is use photography to actually document these different stages, and then working with the repair techs, actually, as you would for a recipe cookbook, writing down the different stages. Interestingly, while this was very useful for us as a technique, one of the primary things that we were interested in as researchers was that intersection between actually what you talk about when you're doing a repair and actually the physical actions of doing a repair. So in this case, the method of taking photographs was slightly flawed, and we had to kind of go back and sync transcripts with actual photographs, time-stamping photographs to see what people were talking about when they were taking. So I bring this up to say, this is also a technique that is constantly emerging and evolving in my own thinking. And in this case, video work would have been much better. Next slide. But if those are examples of kind of doing research in the field, so to speak, and with people, how do you do this sort of project with an object that you don't actually have the makers to engage with? And so it was actually when I came to the museum and got involved with the Summer Institute in Museum Anthropology, which is an NSF supported program that brings graduate students to the museum for 4 weeks to learn about how to use museum collections, that my colleague Candace Green kind of challenged me to take my interest in makers and apply it to objects that are seemingly inert. And if you've been into museums, a lot of the work we do in exhibits is try to bring these objects to life through, contextual photographs, text, etc. But when confronted with an object in storage, what do you do? So what we've done is what I've developed is you bring an object out for the students to look at, and you basically go through stages of looking at this object, and I get them to think about what they see. So it's an exercise in close looking, which can be done with any sort of object. I ask them to make note of the materials, make note of the makers, what they think the maker might be. And then they have to draw. And so they do diagrams, kind of like an exploded diagram, to think about where these objects begin and end. And this pushes them to quickly see the limits of knowledge. Now, key here, I think, to note in this, there's always a tendency among everyone we've worked with to want to jump to the smartphone and figure it out. And actually, the point of this exercise is actually to dwell in that not knowing and be okay with that, and then use it for a prompt for later discovery and thinking through. Next slide. And what I then do is also, after doing this, the students, their drawings, and I will have them circulate and each talk about the different objects they have. Then I also then show them, in this case, this is a drawing that I made, drawing on the work of Bill Davenport, who's an anthropologist who worked in the Solomon Islands. And I should have said the object I showed you was a feather bundle that was used as a valuable exchange in the Santa Cruz Islands of Solomons. And as an object, it's slightly deceptive because it's kind of fallen apart. So it's actually not what students would normally see. But here I show them that and work them through the stages. And again, the point is not to point out what they got wrong, but try to get them to see what they got right, and then the further aspects of knowing that they can explore outside of the museum. Next slide. So I wanted to, before I get into the exhibit that we're doing and hand it over to Colleen, I also wanted to point out that actually the pandemic gave me the opportunity to think through, well, with the museum closed and teaching in the museum closed, how could you take this exploding objects and think about the connections outside of the museum? And so I developed this work with another research assistant, Katie Shinaki, and we actually did exploding street corners. And so what the assignment here was to actually think about infrastructure. So here I'm showing you an image that I took through Google, but it actually gets students out looking at infrastructure and diagramming the various materials that go into making the stuff that surrounds us. So I bring this up to say that, we're talking about museum objects, but literally this can be done with any sort of thing to think about relationships. Next slide. So with that said, a lot of what this thinking about routines is part of a long-term thinking about relationships that are in objects. And this is fed into an exhibit that is going to be opening in the summer of 2023. And its title is Cell Phone Unseen Connections. And here what we're really exploring is that how through the cell phone that you have, the smartphone, that you're really holding the world. And so taking that idea of an exploded object, and we're doing it visually through showing you objects, but also metaphorically to think about the relationships that go into the device. So here we'll have a show that's going to foreground the 65 elements that can be found in your smart device, showing them the mineral objects, showing the people, the places that these materials come from. exploring the science of how this phone works and foregrounding all the infrastructure, wires, etc., that go into making it work. Thinking then about the cultural uses, so the ways in which this device has helped transform us culturally and sustain different cultural traditions. And then thinking about circular economy, so what happens when you're done with it, as well as the impact on society. And so as part of that, we've taken this exploding object and brought it to the cell phone. So if the exhibit, if you will, kind of on a grand scale does it, we are actually going to be working with educators to actually take apart cell phones, to actually open them up and use that as a way to explore science. So hopefully what I've done is seeded some ideas for your own projects. And again, what I would just say is this is a thinking routine that really leans into not knowing. It is creative. You can do it with any sort of object. And I've actually found it one of the most rewarding things I've done. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Colleen.
Thanks, Josh. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific way we've been using this method for this learning activity related to the cell phone exhibit that Dr. Bell just mentioned. So when we take what Dr. Bell just talked about in terms of this anthropology method and translate it for a classroom or informal teaching opportunity for the cell phone exhibit, what the exercise does is it really helps us to slow down and think about the life cycle of all the stuff we use every day, with cell phones kind of as this focus. So it's very much an exercise in developing a sustainability mindset in this case, and an inquiring mindset. And so it invites learners to think more critically and more intentionally about where the things that we kind of mindlessly and habitually use every day, where they come from, who made them, and how, and where they end up. So we hope that that sparks this question, this kind of, okay, so am I okay with that? And what is my role in that picture? What are my obligations to the people and the places responsible for the things I use, I wear? The cell phone is a really great example of that. Our focus, target audience for this exhibit are teens through young adults, people who've grown up with these devices. And it's a great opportunity to reach them with a very relevant object, probably the most relevant object in their lives right now. So to start the exercise for exploding cell phones, we have these questions. What materials are used to make this object? So this gets at kind of what do we know about how things are made that we use in our lives compared to any other time in history. We're very separated from those materials in the modern era. Where are the materials from? So that gets at that globalization question of where things are coming from that we use. And what processes brought them to the locality in which they were used to make this object. So thinking about supply chain complexity, the questions of social and political, environmental factors and impacts. Who made the object? So you can get into discussions about gender, labor, different types of professions, what tools were used. That adds a whole different level, a whole new layer to this kind of diagramming exercise, because once you talk about the tools, you want to understand where those tools came from and what the materials are in those tools. And then this really important question that Josh kind of led us to is, what are the silences? What don't we know? And why don't we know it? So ultimately, it is an exercise in inquiry and not knowing, and it's a little uncomfortable at first. So what I'd like to do is show you it in action. We've got this time-lapse video of a group of young people exploding a cell phone together, and I'll narrate a little bit as it goes. So you can see that here on your screens. So what we do is we generally have the students work together, about 4 to a phone. They start with the components of the phone. We ask them to draw them because that really encourages that close looking that's really so important for any analysis and is really central to all natural history science. We give them the questions and that I just went through, and they start to answer them as best they can by labeling. So the question of what materials are these parts made from, it's a tough one, but it's a really good one to get them started. They look closely and they look for clues. They feel the weight of things, they tap on parts, that kind of thing. They may not be able to go deeper than knowing maybe it's metal, glass, and plastic, but sometimes they do, and you can see them in the video. They're trading components with each other, looking at each other's components. They ask questions out loud, and everyone's bringing different knowledge. So if you could hear them talking, there's a lot going on, lots of ideas and thoughts jumping out all the time. And then we remind them to think about where they think the materials came from. And again, they do their best with prior knowledge. We get a lot of dinosaurs for plastics, as the source for plastics, and sand as the source for glass. They also look for evidence on the components themselves for where they were manufactured. So you can see them using a little loop magnifying glass that they're passing around to try to get that kind of information. So it's really a great inquiry exercise for them, but there's still so much they don't know. So a little way through, once they've kind of reached a wall of knowledge, we give them some help. We do provide some scaffolding. We have materials with the names of the components, and then some great USGS infographics and maps. So they can see more about the minerals that are in the different components and some of the most common places around the world where those minerals are mined. And then we remind them again to add the people to the story and to push farther, really prompting them to think about who mined the minerals, who owns the mines, how do the minerals get processed into usable parts? What about transport, manufacturing? Who designed all of these things, and who figured out that these minerals can do what they do in our phones in the first place? So over time, you can see this web just continues to expand as they get new prompts and think deeper and more broadly. And then at the end of the exercise, we have a discussion about those silences, the surprises, the things that came up, what they want to know more about the supply chain. So we can get into individual stories about minerals and different things that are happening along the supply chain, mining or environmental impacts. And then there's this great opportunity, you can all as teachers appreciate this, to extend the learning with independent research of any of the components or any of the 65 elements used in the phones. So 2 of our interns have done that this summer. They've taken a few of the elements and gone really deep in with those. So, and at the end, invariably someone says, I just never thought about all this before. Why don't I know all this stuff? So those are the kinds of questions that we're hoping that people will ask at the end. And what's really nice is we often see this shift almost instantly, where the young people or the teachers who have done it, who have gone through this exercise with us, they think about their phones differently afterwards. They'll say things like, I thought I wanted a new phone, but now I want to hold on to this one and get it fixed. Instead of getting a new one. They're really having some of those more deeper thinking and critical thinking about where this is coming from and where it's going. And they become advocates for that way of thinking, which is really exciting.
And then I see there's a question in the Q&A from Aaron about what age levels do you do this cell phone exploding objects exercise with? And I'll let Josh and Colleen expand on this. But I will say from our educational perspective, when we do this officially, we do this a lot with our teen interns, so high schoolers. When we offer this as an official school program at the museum, when the new exhibit opens, we are designing the cell phone exploded for grades 6 through 12, so with the cell phone specific content. But that being said, I also have additional programs, this idea of exploding other objects and interrogating them. I regularly do them with our 3rd through 5th grade students as well. That does not mean you can't go broader than that, but we normally do the cell phone specific on my end for middle and high school, but I know Josh and Colleen have done additional ones, so they can comment.
Yeah, I mean, we've done it with a lot of age groups. I mean, so our internship program, we have one that focuses on high school interns. So we've done it with high school students, so 9th to 12th. We've also done it with teachers. So it really is all ages. I think the only thing with the cell phone is the smaller the child, you just have to worry about them putting things in their mouths. But I mean, really, this is something that could be done with almost any age level. But cell phone, any object can be done, yeah.
Great. And then, yeah, if you have any questions at any point, feel free, put them in the Q&A. We have some time at the end to answer questions, but if they're popping up and relevant, we will go ahead and get those answered. So to move on to the explanation game that is on this slide here, one of the things I was really struck by when seeing Josh's routine of what he's been using to interrogate these objects to successfully explode these cell phones was the similarities between his routine and the explanation game. So this is a routine from Harvard's Project Zero. If you're not familiar with the explanation game routine, I will say there are two routines that are called explanation game. This one is the one from the book. So if you don't have the book, download the presentation, screenshot now. It's a really good one. And this, it accomplishes similar goals as Josh's routine, but in a more like a streamlined start to finish where, as I mentioned with the exploded cell phone, there's so many different paths, so many different journeys. So if you wanted to streamline or shorten the activity, this is a good way to go about it. If you wanted to use this in a different capacity, maybe a warm up, something like that. So the thinking routine to go through, it is name it. So name a feature or aspect of the object that you notice, explain it. What could it be? What role or function might it serve? Why might it be there? Give reason. What makes you say that? And then generate alternatives. What else could it be? And what makes you say that? So the image on the screen is a half scraper. So I do know what this is, but I also have the collections object in person. So I'm going to be demonstrating doing this as if I did not know what this object is. And Dr. Bell and Colleen are going to be helping me explode this object on this whiteboard behind me.
All right, so Nicole, I guess we should start with the naming part. Do you want to name a feature or aspect of the object that you notice?
The first thing that I notice is this, what I think is this handle that I believe is made out of wood. So I'm going to put that on my whiteboard. So I'm going to draw it.
How
And
do
this
you
is
know it's
another
made
good,
out of wood?
I think I can see these lines and it looks like other things that are wood before. And also teachers, just an FYI, Josh has gorgeous drawings. This is going to be different. This is a realistic example of what this could look like. So I think this is made of wood.
And I should add, while Nicole's working, is that one, if there is a kind of roadblock sometimes in this exercise, it's that this issue of people being scared of being, artistic in the drawing. And, there is no level of drawing here. It is just getting it on. So,
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So
what function do you think that serves, Nicole?
I think it's the handle because it's the longest part. So I think you would hold it with your hand here because my hand, it fits in my hand really nicely there.
Okay.
But maybe if I'm thinking of something else, it could also be part of the object. Maybe you could use that to do something. I could be wrong and it could not be the object.
Sounds good.
what's at the end of the object?
The end of the object,
Yeah, what's that?
this looks like a stone. This part here looks like other stones I've seen before,
Okay.
but it's flatter. So I'm going to draw this. And I think it's a stone. This is my rock.
And what do you think it would be used for?
Well, it's a little sharp. So maybe it could be used to maybe cut something?
Okay.
I'm not sure.
When you say it's sharp, is that something that is made sharp, or do you think the stone looks like it came that way?
It looks like it was broken to be sharper because there's little pieces missing from all around this edge. So I think it used to be like a regular rock and someone broke it to be sharper.
Okay. How's it connected to the wood?
It looks like some type of brown rope. Yeah. So that looks like rope to me. So I'll draw some lines and I'll say maybe it's rope.
Is it made out of natural fiber or does it look like nylon or something like that?
I think it's natural. I'm not sure if it's made of like leather or if it's made of a plant. It's hard to tell, but I don't think it's plastic or anything like that.
And can you tell how it's holding the stone in place?
It's wrapped around a lot of times, and then there's kind of like a gooey brown thing on top of it holding it in place. And
So
there's a little
gooey
notch
brown
in the
thing,
wood.
what could the gooey brown thing be?
Something sticky, maybe a tar or a glue.
Okay.
I'm gonna just do a little blob for that.
Or resin?
Glue, tar, maybe a resin. But I don't know where that would come from. I think those are all the pieces. I see the wood that I think it's a handle. I think see the stone that I think has been broken to be sharp. And then I see the part that's wrapped around, then it has the goo. So to make this object, someone would have to cut down a tree, shape this into this cylindrical shape, and then also put these notches in it because the tool also fits into the wood. So someone had to make these special cutouts.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone would also have to find the stone, and then they'd have to break it into this specific shape. And then, depending on what this is made of, this could be a couple different things. Because if it's a plant, they'd have to pick it and braid it. And then if it's an animal, they'd have to, it's made of leather, they'd have to hunt an animal and skin it and turn it into leather. That's a whole lot of processes that I'm not sure about. And then whatever this resin or tar is, they'd have to find that and make that and put it over top.
Nice. I really like this example because it is something that not everybody would see, and you have to take part to really understand what the function might be.
Yeah, and I use this. This is because I'm seeing some questions in here, and specifically about some of the elementary. Is I like to do use this object or another stone tool to kind of compare and contrast sometimes against an object that they see more common. So I use a Starbucks cup versus this, and talking about like how, you know, what is hard to make, what is easy to make, what does that mean, how do these objects get to us? And it's a really interesting juxtaposition. And then if we can advance to the next slide because this will answer some of our questions that are coming up, because we're hearing a lot of, you know, what are recommendations for other things we can explode. So like we said, cell phones have been exploded. Josh did street corners. We just did a hafted scraper, but Josh has exploded a lot of objects. So right here we have Cheerios. So this is good across all grade levels. And you think about a box of Cheerios, there is lots of things you can get into with that. You have the box, what the box is made of. You have the graphic design and the inks that are on the box. You have the bag that's made of, you know, there's plastic. You have the actual Cheerio itself and everything that goes into there. So you think of something as simple as breakfast cereal that a lot of students have experience with, and it could really be used. And then if you go to the next slide.
And if I can jump in for a second
Yeah.
there, I mean, I think one thing to point out too is, you know, if you wanted to get super specific, you could use chemistry and think about that, right? Then there's also a way to teach geography for it, to think about the different places and the distances. So there's all these different intersections. And then one could think about how, for example, cereal has changed over time. So you could bring in history, social history, economic history, literature, etc. Go for it.
Yeah, and then I also just show another great example of toilet paper here. So we've done lots of objects, and we had a specific question from Jennifer about anything else we'd recommend for grades 3rd through 5th. And it really is, I think, you don't have to have like a, an object, like a museum object. You can take anything from your classroom, something they're familiar with, something they see every day, and have them look at it a different way. Like you can do, I don't know if there's any specific recommendations from the group, but on most things.
Yeah, the only thing I would recommend is you can do certainly anything, right? You could do a seed and go back to a tree type of thing. I think it helps where they're, particularly for younger students, where there's like the example that Nicole just used of the hafted scraper, where there are a few different materials, so there are things to bounce off of, or things like a golf ball are great, but only really if you've opened it up. So or you could use it as a process to say, okay, well, we can sit outside, but what's inside? So there are lots of different ways to make it work.
One of the ones that we talked about that I think would be great, that has a lot of potential, is a book. So you could just take any kind of picture book in a classroom, and you can imagine where that can go so many directions, with not only where the paper comes from, but all the color and the dyes and all of the people that are involved in making that book, the glue, that could be a fun one.
As well as the author and their imagination.
Right, right.
Yeah. And I'm seeing from Shelby, I think we partially answered this about what other devices and objects you can recommend. And I've had the fortune of being around teachers who have been so creative about this, like thinking about things like, I'm a music teacher and I can explode jazz. Mm-hmm. I'm an English teacher and I want to explode objects in the book The Giver. So it really is, whatever your curriculum is, you can find those different intersections, which are great. And then we have a question from Kathy about, can this work with pictures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the thing with pictures one could do is not only think about the picture as an object, but then, and so think about the paint and think about the what it's printed on or painted on, but then also what's in it, right? So New York Times has been doing great, they did one recently about a painting, I've forgotten which painting, but they've annotated and do things, and that's a kind of standard art historical technique, which is great.
Yeah. And then a question from Shelby about, do you ever use cast of objects? And then do you ever use the actual objects, even if they're really fragile? So we definitely do use cast a lot in education. And that's another layer of something being interesting, because you can consider both the original object and then what goes into making a cast. Because sometimes when people think, oh, it's a cast, it's just fake. But, what goes into having to do one of those high-tech realistic scans? What are they made out of? How are they painted to look like the actual thing? So that could be, something really interesting. But again, like going back to the original thing, like you can explode it. If you don't have the actual object, you can explode a pencil, anything you have in your classroom. And then a really interesting question about Henry, about inquiry-based versus traditional information giving, and then if like frustration with like not having the answers and not going in a direction. And I'll say from my perspective, especially with collections-based learning, there is kind of some of that tension when students sometimes come to us in the museum, where we do have several science-based school programs where there's not an answer. And the point of the program is not getting an answer. It is the process of science and seeing what comes out of it. What questions are arising from them? What hypotheses are they bringing to the table? And we have seen, I think, a shift in recent years where, we bring them in, we tell them, it's the scientific process. It's not a linear scientific method. And we are really shaking up a lot of, time, like, this is different from what I'm seeing in schools, a different way of approaching things. But I have seen a shift over the last, I would say, at least 5 years of a lot of students are coming in with a lot more experience using inquiry-based, even in science education, which has been a really interesting shift.
Yeah, and I think with the frustration, part of what I try to do when I do it is you circulate around. So when I use museum objects, I make sure that I have kind of done the work to kind of show them, because and that's part of the kind of revelation or reveal at the end. But I think so part of an instructor's challenge is to have some knowledge so that you can give them tidbits, or at least have thought about it yourself, so you can provide prompts and say, well, what about this? Have you thought about this? And just kind of push them along. But yeah, students get frustrated, but it's that's part of the learning process, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that initial struggle is important, and we do see, especially among high school students, they have different types of knowledge, and having them pull that out and together and share that, I think, is really exciting, and they take ownership of their learning that way, in a different way.
And when they're in groups, they bounce ideas off of each other. So I think if there's a challenge, sometimes it's getting them to feel comfortable enough to say, I don't know what plastic's made of, or I think this is plastic, and kind of push that boundary and admit that they don't know things.
And feel okay about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really ties into a question that was also asked about, do you think the explanation game is process is valuable without a facilitator prompting in real time that we modeled? And I would say definitely. A lot of, like, part of it is like that initial discomfort and the struggle in going through things, and we just model just to show some different ways. But when we do, especially Josh's routine, they get asked the questions, and we're floating and we're checking in, but we are not on top of them. It's very like stand back and let the process unfold with the group and see what directions they're taking based on their prior knowledge and their interest.
And I've done it where I give it as part of a 3-part assignment, where students get an object from the museum, they look at it, then they go home after, and they take their notes and they write a paper about what they've seen. So there's a way of also giving it to students to do in the comfort of their own home and then come back. But I think there the issue is just creating a scenario where students share what they've learned with each other, so it's not just them alone.
Josh, there's a question here I think you can respond to from Maya, wondering about the exploration of energy transfer as a point of analysis, leveraging the cross-cutting concepts to have folks consider connections.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that gets into wonderful thinking about tools and makers. And if you have access to that information, I think here you're only limited by what you either know or you can find the resources for. So, full disclosure, the toilet paper, I watched a video of how to make toilet paper to do that. So I think if the information's out there, that is a fantastic thing to do. And then you can also challenge the students to think about what that is. And there are resources out there, carbon footprints and those calculators. But then I think more interesting perhaps is to get them to think about the energy that goes into making things, and push them out into the world to find that out.
Right. So this would be just an initial exercise that then prompts that deeper exploration, that question.
And
I think we have.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah. Go
I
ahead,
was just going to say, I've had colleagues develop this, and they have their students do posters and create posters as part of their project, which they bring in. You could certainly have students do different stages, right? So an initial mapping, and then perhaps as a group, and then different students take different parts, maybe it's localities. We had one student, when they did the kind of sharing their explosion, they took their cell phone back to the Big Bang and narrated, much to the delight and groans of their classmates, like all the way from the Big Bang to the creation of the minerals and elements that make up our stuff. And it was absolutely fantastic.
That's nice.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing.
And we have less than a minute left, but I'm going to try to answer this about opportunities for students at the museum, especially around this. I will say we have both on-site and digital opportunities for students. We have a suite of digital school programs and resources that are free to be booked and used. We will also hopefully be welcoming on-site school programs again at the museum this fall. Those are also free of charge. And then this thinking routine, if you cannot make it to the museum to do Exploded Cell Phone with your students, there's also going to be a national curriculum that is tied to the launch of this exhibit. So we're going to be able to push this out, and it can be used by everyone regardless of whether or not you can actually come to the museum. But we hope that you enjoyed today, and thank you so much for attending our session and learning about exploding objects.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye, everyone.